recording may be accessed by other participants and by other organisations and individuals with interest in setting up a charity. So please do turn off your camera if you don't want to be shown on screen, but really it would only focus on the speakers as well. We'll stop recording when we get to the Q&A session as well. There aren't any fire alarms where I am, but please do keep an ear out for those wherever you may be. And please do respect confidentiality and respect one another in this session, but also do feel free to share the learning from this session within your organisation. You'll hopefully notice that closed captions or subtitles have been enabled, and you can turn these on and off by clicking the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please. Okay. So before I hand over to the Withers team, we've got Phil, Chris and Hannah with us today to introduce themselves. I'm just going to cover a little bit of why we're running this session. So some of you may have come along to our Setting Up a Charity webinar earlier this year. Following on from that, we decided to take a deeper dive into one of our top areas for inquiries when it comes to setting up charity structures. And we know that deciding on a legal structure for your charity can be very confusing. As many of you may well know, and you may have known me at SCC, I've seen a few familiar faces. When the Small Charities Coalition closed earlier this year, NCVO and the FSI took on the mantle of supporting small charities via the Small Charity Help Desk. And NCVO is really keen to carry on SCC's legacy of supporting small organisations in their early stages. We want to make sure we dispel any myths, clarify any jargon, and make the complex simple. So just back to the previous slide a second, Hannah, sorry. So before I do hand over to Withers, we're just going to launch a quick poll to get an idea of the types of organisations who have joined us for this session. So that should pop up on your screen, hopefully. And if you could please answer the question, what is your current legal structure? And if you're undecided or you're not sure, don't worry. That's what this session will hopefully help you to figure out. So just a couple of minutes to allow everybody to participate in the poll. Okay. If you haven't participated in the poll yet, if you're able to, it should be up on your screen. We've had nearly everybody. 83%. So that's probably about right, isn't it? If we're not going to do it with this team and NCVO team. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. And you should be able to see the results up on the screen now. Can you just give me a wave, Chris, if you can see the results on the screen? No. Just to quickly reflect on those results, 48% here have chosen charitable company. That's the top choice there, followed by CIO, 18%, charitable trust, 14%, other, 6%, and 8% have chosen I don't know. Okay. Excellent. Over to Withers.
Thanks, Amy. Now, those poll results were broadly what I think we were expecting. That's kind of in line with our experience in the sector. So just to add to Amy's helpful introduction, I'm Phil Reeds. I'm a partner in the charities and philanthropy team at Withers. Chris Priestley, who I think you'll see as, I think he's called Withers London because he's in our office today, is another partner in the team. And Hannah Brearley is also with us today, who's an associate in our team. We're all charity law specialists. So this is the sort of thing that we enjoy talking about quite regularly. And hopefully we'll have some helpful insights to you on this topic today. Next slide, please, Hannah. So what we're going to run through, we'll start off just with a quick recap before we dive into charitable structures, just to touch again on, is a charity actually the right thing? And we'll signpost back to our previous session on that. I think I've seen somebody in the chat asking to see that already. And then, as Amy said, we're going to aim for plain English and unpacking jargon. So we'll first of all say, what do we actually mean by legal structure? Then we'll go through the two main areas of options, two main categories. So unincorporated structures, incorporated structures. Then we'll think about how you can change your structure if you need to. And then a few kind of related topics just to finish off with. So membership, which we'll again unpack a little bit, and trading. So whether that's charitable trading or non-charitable trading, and the implications that can have for structuring. And then Amy has some useful resources to share. And hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end. Next slide, please, Hannah. So as I said, just to recap the starting point before we get into what kind of structure of charity should you actually have a charity. So the previous session that we did on this is on NCVA's YouTube channel. So you'll be able to find that. And I think I'm right in saying that's a recording along with the slides. So you'll be able to watch it effectively as if you were there on the day. So what a charity is, an entity that operates for a charitable purpose, is the starting point. So when you're thinking about whether a charity is the right thing for you, what is your purpose is the first question. What is it that you're actually hoping to achieve? What is it that you want to be set up for? What's the work? And then you can look at whether that is actually genuinely charitable, according to the list of purposes that are set out in the Charities Act 2011. The second part of what a charity does is that work, if it is charitable, also has to be for the public benefit. And you'll see from the other session that public benefit is a legal concept that needs some unpacking. But just to give you an example, let's say you're a charity or you're an organization for the advancement of education, because you want to educate children. That's clearly charitable. But if you say, well, the only children who are allowed to come along and join my school are the ones who live on my road, who I already know and who are my children's friends, that's too narrow a pool. So you'd fail on the public benefit test. I don't imagine any of you would be setting up that school. But just to illustrate the point, there are a few other nuances around public benefit that you can pull out from our previous session. Other things to think about when you're exploring whether you want to set up a charity. Remember that trustees of charities are subject to quite strict set of duties. That there is a burden, essentially, a price to pay for acquiring the benefits of charitable status, which are mentioned on the slide, and particularly the tax advantages which charities do enjoy. There are other ways to get into the sector as well, apart from setting up your own charity, so you can work with an existing organisation. We've mentioned a donor advised fund on the slide, which is a kind of a way to put money into another charity and then sort of administer it as if it's your organisation. Again, refer you back to our previous session for a little bit more on that. So there are different options, and there are things to think quite carefully and hard about before you actually decide, yes, I want to do a charity, I want to set one up. Yes, my work's charitable, I will pass the public benefit test and we're going to push the green button. So just to flag that there is some thinking to do, I think. So if we click on, please, Hannah. And Hannah's going to talk a little bit about what do we mean by legal structure, as I said before, Chris and I take over to go through the two categories.
Hi everybody, welcome. So what do we mean by a legal structure? So this is separate from, as Phil's just described, the application really for charitable status. To be a charity as a kind of wrapper, what we're going to be looking at today is the form of which your organisation takes, whether, as has already been flagged, this is incorporated, such as trusts or associations, or incorporated, so companies and CIOs or charitable incorporated organisations. So the structure of your organisation really will form the structure in which you can operate. So the parameters that you are subject to, the rules, the laws, the regulations that your members, that your trustees and directors are subject to, and that you have to follow. So it's really about establishing that basis on which you can operate before you then look, I suppose, to the charitable status point, which is a slightly different thing, like it says on the slide, a wrapper almost. Whether you choose or which structure you choose will depend on what your charity does, where it operates, how it operates, what activities it wants to undertake, what your trustees are able to do and prepared to do in terms of administrative burdens, as Phil already flagged. And I think one question that is likely to come up throughout the presentation today is which structure is best, which structure is easiest. And I think what will come out as we discuss this today is that really depends on what you're doing. There is no one gold standard, gold star structure that fits perfectly for everybody and that works really well. So I suppose to take forward before we go into the further detail is just to think about what your organisation is hoping to achieve and how the information we give you today will enable you to make those decisions and think more deeply about those points. But yeah, just think of it as what rules apply to me, what structures apply to me, and how can I operate.
Thanks, Hannah. So I'll have a quick look at unincorporated structures to start with. To draw out the distinction a bit more, so as Hannah was saying, an unincorporated structure means that there's really no separate entity there. We're just thinking about the individuals involved. They continue to operate in that way. They are individuals. Whereas if you have a corporate structure, so if you're a company, the company itself has what we would call a separate legal personality. So that is, the company can enter into contracts, it can incur liabilities, it can sue and be sued in its own name as if it were a person. That's what Chris will come on to. But with unincorporated structures, we don't have that thing. It's just the people who are involved. So, I mean, the two key ones are the ones that were mentioned in the poll. So trusts and unincorporated associations. And as the poll drew out, trusts are generally more common than unincorporated associations, where we're thinking about unincorporated structures. So, I mean, to start with trusts, this is kind of the old-fashioned classic model for a charity, and essentially that there is a group of individual people, the trustees, and they hold assets, whether that's money or land or a community building, whatever it might be, on charitable trust to deliver the particular purpose that they're set up to deliver. So it is those people those individuals essentially where the buck stops. If they want to enter into a contract on behalf of the charity, they will do that in their own names, albeit in their capacity as trustees of the charity. For trusts, you really are just thinking about the trustees. So let's say you have 5 trustees. So far as the charity structure itself goes, those are the only people involved. So there won't be a wider membership. So people who are also involved at a governance level, but aren't formally trustees. That's not really something that you encounter with a trust. You do, on the other hand, with unincorporated associations. So it's this kind of thing that you might often see holding some sort of community asset, a village hall or something, or perhaps some sort of sports club like the bowls club in the village. Could be a charitable unincorporated association doing that work. There might be a managing committee. So the people on that committee would be the charity trustees for the purposes of charity law. But there might also be a wider membership. So all of the people who might pay some sort of subscription and get to use the facilities. So it's another kind of unincorporated model. So if we click on, please, Hannah. So when might you think about using these sorts of structures as opposed to the corporate structures? Well, I mean, these things, so trusts and unincorporated associations, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, are pretty easy to set up. They're quite simple and straightforward. You essentially, in each case, have a kind of governing document. So in the case of a trust, that would be a trust deed. In the case of an unincorporated association, probably a set of rules or a constitution. Everybody would essentially sign up to those, and at that point, you have your structure set up, and you can carry on and operate it. So it's pretty simple to get going, and in contrast to the corporate structures. Having said that, on an administrative side, things aren't quite as straightforward. So as I've said, if you're entering into contracts, the trustees will need to do that personally. Similarly, setting up a bank account, if the charity is to have any staff, they will be employed by the trustees as individuals, not by the company or CIO. If you own land, there can be tricky wrinkles around that. So particularly when you're transferring land, when trustees are appointed and removed, ideally they should be on the title, and you end up getting into some legal convolutions when you're trying to work that out. There are workarounds that you can do, but it is more complex than with a corporate structure, where no matter if you swap in or out trustees, the land is just held by the corporate. So we really look at these options where the activities are fairly local. So certainly in the UK, they are doing things that are relatively simple. So the classic example for a trust is a grant-making trust. So it's really no problem to have your group of trustees who take in the money in the form of donations, pay it out in the form of grants, and really don't have any more complicated activity going on than that. Very often there won't be any staff, there won't need to be any premises. It's all fairly straightforward. And similarly, the community groups that I've mentioned, although I think even in those cases, there is a little bit of a move towards using more corporate structures probably. Next slide, please, Hannah. So what does it mean? And these slides, I should say, are deliberately quite densely packed with information so that they can be a kind of reference guide for you going ahead. So this is to summarize some of the key points. So unincorporated structures, you remember, no separate legal identity. So it's not a legal person that can enter into contracts, incur liabilities, as I said. So the trustees of the charity have personal liability in principle for the debts or other obligations, liabilities of the charity. but they do, obviously, so far as they're acting within their duties, enter into those obligations in their capacity as trustees of the charity. So that means essentially they are committing the charity's assets, as I say, so far as they're acting within their duties, which means they're entitled to be indemnified in the event that they need to be. Essentially, the charity assets sit behind them. Obviously, though, there can be uncomfortable situations if the trustees commit to obligations that are beyond the scale of the charity's assets, or if they commit to things that aren't directly or comfortably within the scope of their duties. So things can feel a little bit less comfortable on that front. And just at the end of the slide, a reminder that obviously all registered charities, whatever their structure, do have ongoing requirements around the regulatory framework and their own compliance. So regular filings, you're still answerable to the Charity Commission in the same way if you're a trust or an unincorporated association. You'll still need to make your event-driven filings, which might be things like serious incident reports and these sort of things. It's just that the advantages are around setup costs, winding up costs can be lower, that can be simpler to achieve. So there are some benefits. Next slide, please, Hannah. So Chris is going to run you through some of the incorporated options now.
Thanks, Phil, and good morning, everybody. So looking at incorporated structures, and the poll results are indicative of the fact that most charities these days do have a corporate legal form, and most new charities are set up with a corporate form. Charitable trusts were historically the way that people set up charities, but the world has moved on quite a bit. So looking at the incorporated structure, the most common examples are something called a company limited by guarantee or a charitable incorporated organization. Charitable companies limited by guarantee are the classic form for a not-for-profit organization. So with a for-profit company, you would invest in the company and you would have shares in return, and that would entitle you to the profits of the company, which are paid to you by way of dividend. In a not-for-profit situation, we have a provision where the members have to contribute the sum of £1, usually just a nominal sum, in the event that the company doesn't have enough assets to meet its debts. So that's where the guarantee bit comes in. You guarantee, but only up to a very small amount, the liabilities of the company. Now, charitable companies limited by guarantee are not the same as a for-profit company. The members cannot benefit from the company other than by receiving charitable benefits in the same way as anybody else. So if you're a charitable company and you provide let's say a debt counselling service, and you're a member of that company, you can't get any financial advantage out of it. You can't get at the assets of the charity. You're not entitled to those. But of course, you can get advice on debt counselling in the same way as anybody else that would benefit. The bit that gets a bit confusing, I find, is this distinction of trustees and directors. If you have a charitable company, then that company is subject to charity law because, as Hannah said, you've got the charity wrapper, you're a registered charity, so you're accountable to the Charity Commission. But because you have the legal form of a company, you're also subject to company law, and you have to make filings with Companies House. So those who are in charge of the management and administration of the charity are at the same time both charity trustees for the purposes of charity law and company directors for the purposes of company law. And some charities call them directors, board members, some call them trustees. The legal position is you're both a company director and a charity trustee. So moving on to the next slide, when charities started to more commonly have the legal form of a company, so lots of new charities were setting up as corporate corporate entities, and lots of trusts were converting to become companies because they wanted the benefit of that status. Lots of us were saying, well, actually, there isn't a specifically designed form, a corporate form for charities. And so the Charitable Incorporated organisation came about, I'm surprised actually it's 11 years ago already, but yes, 2011. Now, CIOs, lots of people like CIOs because you don't also have to then register with Companies House. The CIO comes into existence when your constitution is accepted and registered by the Charity Commission, and you're accountable only to the Charity Commission. They can be structured in two ways. There are two levels of participation. You have both members and trustees. And in the foundation model, you don't have a wider membership. So because the law says you have to have both trustees and members usually are the same people. So that's the foundation model. If you are an organisation that wants to have a wider membership, and I'll talk a bit about membership in a moment, then you have that association model where the people who are members are not exactly the same as those who are trustees. Now, one of the great advantages of a corporate structure, as Phil mentioned, is the entity exists in its own right separately from the trustees and members. So you can contract in the name of the charity, and you can hold property in the name of the charity. And that's really helpful because over time, of course, trustees will change. If you're a charitable trust, you have to hold property in the name, usually in the name of the trustees, and that should be updated if the trustees change. So a CIO or a charitable company is quite helpful in that respect because it's got separate legal personality. Just moving on to the next slide. As I say, most charities that are set up these days will be CIOs or charitable companies limited by guarantee. There are very few these days that get set up as unincorporated associations or trusts. It's not to say there's a problem if you have that legal status, but it's just more common to have that corporate form because you have that separate legal identity, and you also have the benefit of limited liability. So we would always say, if you are an organisation, certainly one that wants to operate overseas, I think you would probably have a corporate form and either a CIO or a charitable company limited by guarantee. Because the CIO is less well known overseas than a company, most people are familiar with a company, we tend to see more charitable companies as the corporate form for charities operating overseas. If you're receiving government funding or local authority funding, or you're providing a service to the public, then certainly I would expect you to have a corporate form. And there is arguably slightly higher regulatory compliance, but lots and lots and lots of charities are CIOs and companies, and they manage that regulation pretty well. So just moving on. As I say, they have incorporated structures, separate legal personality, and the important point around limited liability is that in the event something goes wrong and there is a debt, it is the charity rather than the individuals who owe the money. And if there isn't sufficient money in the charity, then there is an insolvency, but you can't get at the trustees personally. They are not personally liable unless they've obviously acted fraudulently or done something where they have inadvertently created liability for themselves. And those trustees and directors are able to use the assets of the charity to cover the costs of running the charity. So that is the advantage of limited liability, separate legal personality, and that's why I think corporate forms are by far and away the most common legal form. So just moving on to the next slide. As I say, if you're a charitable company limited by guarantee, you'll file a Charity Commission annual return, and you'll file an annual return or confirmation statement to Companies House. The advantage of a CIO over a charitable company limited by guarantee is you just have a single regulator in the Charity Commission. And there are rules around filing accounts. And again, if you are a charitable company, you'll have to file your accounts with 2 regulators. With a CIO, you're just dealing with the Charity Commission. So moving on, Phil, do you want to talk about changing structure? Yeah,
thanks, Chris. And I wonder if this slide is feeling more interesting to any of you now than it was at the beginning. You do find that a lot of this, even if you were perfectly happy when you set up your organisation, as time goes by, it's always worth revisiting, re-exploring what the different options are, and thinking about, well, what's actually best for my charity? How should we be set up? So we've just put some examples on the slide of where you might perhaps be having that sort of exploration on your board. So perhaps the activities have changed, which you do see in charities from time to time. You might have an organisation that starts out as a grant maker, and then over time, actually, the trustees think, we quite like to actually get our hands dirty and get involved in some of this work directly. So then the risk profile might start to go up depending on what that looks like, if you move to being operational rather than a funder. You might, as an unincorporated charity, find that you're going to have some land. You might be left some land, or you might feel that actually you need to take on some premises given the way that your work is developing. So as we've said, things can be simpler on that front with a corporate arrangement. Perhaps you've just got a lot bigger, and we do often see this. The charity that's mentioned at the bottom of the slide here, Kids Company, which I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, essentially found itself in a situation where it grew so rapidly that its scale outstripped its infrastructure. And that left the trustees with something of a tricky position. I mean, that was a company in that example, but similarly, you do quite often see trusts or unincorporated associations that are very successful, and then find that actually the way we set up originally just isn't fit for purpose for what's now become very large. And I've also mentioned on the slide that if your structure in some way feels like it doesn't quite match your activities or your risk profile, it can make it difficult to recruit trustees. Trustees are quite often fairly alive to these sorts of issues and alive to the usually theoretical possibility of personal liability arising for them. And you often, when recruiting, find that you get probing questions around things like, what is the structure? Why is it set up that way? What does that mean for me? So it's good to have answers to those sorts of questions. The next slide, please, Hannah. So you can change your structure, is the answer. So what does that look like? How does it work? And I should say that my assumption here in putting these slides together, or our assumption, was that almost invariably you would be moving from an unincorporated to a corporate structure. That does tend to be the direction of travel. So ordinarily, you'd have your, let's say, your charitable trust. You would want to move to a corporate structure for some of the reasons I've outlined. So rather than it being a straight conversion, so just one thing morphing into another, which isn't possible under the law currently, you would set up alongside your unincorporated charity a new charity. So whether that's a company limited by guarantee or a CIO, as Chris was describing, you would register, assuming that you're not an exempt charity that doesn't have to register. You would register with the Charity Commission. You'd then enter into a transfer agreement to transfer the entire undertaking, so the assets and liabilities, across into the new charity, after which you'd ordinarily close and probably wind up your existing charity, but we'll come back to that briefly in a moment. How complex that process is very much depends on what's in your transferring charity. So if there's land, you'll obviously have to think about a conveyancing process for that. We've mentioned permanent endowment on the slide, which is a kind of property, usually money, it can be land and buildings, that's held on specific trusts that require it to be used in a certain way. That can introduce a bit of complexity. You might have staff who will transfer over under 2P. You might have pensions issues to think about. So there can be particular wrinkles that you would just need to work through and usually take advice on. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it very often is a good idea with this sort of project. Another wrinkle that you have to engage with when changing structure in this way is that the terms, so let's say your two boards are identical, because after all you are just changing your structure, there can be a technical conflict to think about there, because the trustees of your old charity owe a duty to act in the best interests of that charity, and correspondingly in the new charity they owe a duty to act in the best interests of that charity. And depending on the terms of the transfer, there can be a conflict issue that they can't work through themselves, so you have to get a charity commission order. That's more straightforward and less scary than it might sound, and it is something that the commission does fairly readily. So just going back to whether you wind up your old charity, so your charitable trust in my scenario, that is sometimes done, and it has certainly historically been done, where you're the sort of organisation that typically receives a lot of legacy income. And that's because wills are sometimes drafted in such a way that the legacy will succeed and come to the charity only if it still exists at the relevant date, so the date of death of the testator or testatrix. If it has ceased to exist, so even if you've wound it up following an incorporation of the type I'm describing, the gift may fail. So historically, people have kept the old charity ticking along, with some nominal assets in it, and everybody's been a bit dissatisfied with this, because it clogs up the register of charities a bit. It means that there are charities floating around that aren't really real charities anymore. So the Charities Act 2022 has tried to make that process cleaner, so that actually those sorts of legacies will still succeed, even if there isn't a shell charity, provided that this transfer, this incorporation process goes on the Charity Commission's register of mergers. So that's just another area to think about. And a final footnote at the end of that slide: if you're not a charity but a community interest company, so again I refer you back to our previous session, there is a direct route to convert directly one way into another structure. And again, a community interest company isn't a charity, but it is a kind of not-for-profit vehicle. So there is a direct conversion route there. And now next slide, please, Hannah, and Chris will talk a little bit about membership.
Thanks, Phil. I mentioned membership a bit earlier in terms of the different levels of participation and governance. So on the unincorporated charity side, an unincorporated association will have a group of members and they will elect an executive committee, and it's that committee that will then run the organisation. In a CIO and a company limited by guarantee, so the corporate forms of charity, the law says actually you can't just have a board of directors or charity trustees, you must have a membership as well. Sometimes the members are the directors and the trustees, so they're the same people. Other times it's a wider membership. And we see all sorts of examples of different charities. Membership is generally a really good and helpful thing, but there's no legal requirement to have a membership that is different from your trustees. We also see some organizations that decide they don't want to have a wider membership, and others decide actually we do. And there are pros and cons of each, and you can change your structure to allow for membership or change membership if you want, depending on what the constitution you have says. I think membership, can bring real benefits to the work of the charity, particularly when the charity's members are active and helping shape the strategy and direction of the organisation. They're a group of people that can hold the trustees to account. So the trustees need to explain what they're doing to the members, and the membership can ask questions. So I think that enhances the board's transparency and accountability. And the membership can have views around the needs of beneficiaries, particularly if you're a service provider, and your membership can be a source of future trustees or indeed of fundraising. Sometimes we see things go wrong. And so I think what often happens is people forget who their members are and don't know who their members are. So that can be problematic. So it's important just to be clear who are our members and maintain a register of members so there is clarity, because there are certain things that the members have to take a decision on that the trustees don't have power to do without recourse to the members. And so, in terms of good governance, it's being clear, do we know who our members are? Do we know what the purpose and rights and obligations of our members are? And do we know who our trustees are? And are they comfortable that they understand their legal responsibilities and their position? Because it's the trustees who are ultimately legally responsible for the organisation. So if there's an issue and the Charity Commission get involved, it's the trustees who have to deal with the Charity Commission rather than the members. Sometimes, as I say, there are issues with how members are voting and whether or not they're acting properly. And I've put on the slide there, I'm sorry, a lawyer has to mention a court case at some point. There was a Supreme Court case decision back in 2020 where the law was clarified around the role of members, and members are really in the same position as trustees. If you're acting as a member, you need to act in the best interest of the charity, what you think is in the best interest of the charity. So that's a bit about membership. I think it's a very useful thing, but it does come with its own issues. Bill, charity trading.
Thanks, Chris. Charity trading is a large topic, as a lot of the topics are that we've been running through. And I've seen some comments that there are a lot of terms flying around, which there certainly are. Hopefully we are unpacking them as we go, but do raise them in questions if there are things that you'd like us to go through again or in more detail. So charity trading, what do I mean by this? I trailed at the beginning that this is something that can have implications for the way that you structure things. By trading, that really has its common sense meaning broadly. So are you doing things in the way of buying in stock, selling it for profit? Are you selling tickets? Are you kind of engaged in something that has the feel of a business type activity, rather than the simple charity model that I've mentioned a couple of times of the straightforward grant maker, donations in, grants out. And if you are the sort of charity that trades or does this sort of work, then there are a few more things to think about that, as I say, can have an implication for structure. So to dive into trading a little bit more, there are two types that we would usually talk about. So there's charitable trading, which is often called primary purpose trading. And there's also non-charitable trading, which predictably is often called non-primary purpose trading. Charitable trading is the kind of thing that charities do all the time that actually directly furthers their purposes. It's charitable in itself. So if you think of a museum charging an entry fee, if that's a charitable museum, it furthers its charitable work by getting people in to look at the collections. It funds itself by charging the entry fee. So that's charitable trading. It directly furthers the purpose. Non-charitable trading might be if that same museum has a gift shop where it sells pencils and rubbers and teddy bears and tote bags purely to raise money. So that exercise does not itself directly further the charity's purposes. It's not about people looking at the collections. So that's non-charitable or non-primary purpose trading. There are a few legal nuances that you can get into around this. Charities, for example, are allowed to do a little bit of non-charitable trading without that causing a problem in terms of tax, which I'll come on to in a moment. And there are some specific rules around gift shops and this sort of thing, coffee shops, within the kind of museum that I was talking about. But those are the broad brush principles. So let's think about selling our pencils and tote bags. Is that something that the charity can properly do? There are two main issues to explore. So the first is your museum charity is set up to be a museum, and it will have powers in its governing document, which are really the only things that the trustees are authorised to do. So those will all be bound into furthering the charitable purpose. Selling pencils and tote bags doesn't do that. So we've got a question: do the trustees actually have the power legally to sell those things and to do that non-charitable activity? They might have the power to do a little bit. They almost certainly won't have the power to do it on whatever scale they like, and certainly not to allow it to be a primary activity of their charity. The other issue to think about is tax. So with generally, if you're a charity, whatever your activity, you're entitled to tax benefits. So this will be tax on income, capital gains, and business rates, things like this. Where you're doing charitable trading, primary purpose trading, any profits that you make on that trading are exempt from tax. So you won't get a bill from the tax man or woman if you are doing that sort of trading. If you're doing non-primary purpose trading, the tax or HMRC will say, well, actually, you only get those benefits if you're doing charitable stuff. We're not interested in giving you an exemption from paying tax if you're selling tote bags. So we're going to bill you on that, thank you, on all of those profits. So there, again, you have a bit of a difficulty because a charity ought not really to be paying tax. It should be doing charitable stuff and sitting within the nice safe harbour of its exemptions. So what you often do in this sort of scenario is actually have your museum charity and sitting beneath it and a wholly owned non-charitable trading company. So this is just your normal commercial company limited by shares that Chris mentioned as the kind of starting point when you're thinking about what a company looks like. This is a very plain vanilla trading company. So that can sail off and sell as many tote bags as it likes. It's not doing anything charitable, so there are no issues for it around things like powers. Obviously, companies do, though, pay tax on their profits. So how do we square that circle? Well, in fact, the law and tax policy provide a get out whereby the trading company can donate its profits each year up to the charity prior to paying tax. So in fact, the tax is saved and the charity is in a position that it would have been if in fact there had never been any suggestion of tax being paid. Again, as I've mentioned a few times, there are wrinkles around this. It's not a perfect leak-free, tax-free situation, but it is pretty good, and it's something that HMRC and the Charity Commission are comfortable with. There are things to look at in detail, I mean, particularly around managing conflicts of interest or loyalty as between individuals who sit both on the charity board and the trading company board. There's some good governance to work on around those points. Another advantage that's mentioned on the slide, if you do decide to use a trading company for this sort of work, is that does ring fence any commercial risk associated with that undertaking, which can make things feel a little bit more comfortable for the charity and its trustees. So that was a quick canter through some reasonably involved issues around trading companies. Hopefully it was helpful. As I say, we can discuss it further if needed, and you can always refer back to this presentation on NCVO's YouTube channel if you need to. So that's all we were going to run through, I think. So back over to Amy as our able host, who I think will shortly be opening up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you, Hannah and Chris as well. That a very thorough presentation, but you're right, there is a lot to cover. And I'm sure this will have prompted some questions as well from our audience today. There's been a few questions come in already. Hannah, are we okay maybe to stop sharing the slides so we can see people? And we're going to just stop the recording there. Pause the recording whilst we go through the Q&A. Just waiting for that to happen. Okay, excellent. So I did see a question in the chat around whether we've got a step-by-step guide to setting up a CIO, and actually the answer is yes. We've got the charity setup tool, which was something that the Small Charities Coalition set up, and which NCVO and the FSI in partnership have taken over. So specifically, we're linking here, the second link on the page here, to the section on choosing your legal structure, but the whole guide is a step-by-step process to setting up and registering a charity. So not just a CIO, but any of the forms we have spoken about today. You'll also see on this slide various other resources. I think my colleague Sophie's put the first two in the chat, and we'll make sure that you get these in the follow-up email. NCVO's own guidance on choosing your legal structure, as well as various bits of guidance from the Charity Commission. And we've also taken note of specific things mentioned today, and we'll make sure to send out those links as well. Next slide, please. So as has been touched upon a couple of times during the session, we had an initial session earlier this year on setting up a charity, which is available to watch on YouTube. And may answer a lot of the questions that I think people had today, which I didn't quite get into because they were maybe more on that topic. And we have a third session coming up in November in the lead up to Trustees Week on writing and amending your governing document. So we'll put a link to that in the chat, but also these slides are hyperlinked as well. This session will cover how to choose the governing document that's right for you, tips for writing your governing document, including your charitable purposes, and how to make changes and when to ask for permission. And recording of that will also be available on YouTube. And we're also running a series of free webinars at NCVO during Trustees Week, which will put some information about that in the chat and again in the follow-up email. Before we signpost you to further support, I just want to quickly run a second poll to establish how you might be feeling about your legal structure after the session. Some of you, I think, did answer it in the first instance because it came up when maybe it shouldn't have done. But we're just going to launch a second poll here. So the question is, does your current legal structure meet your organizational needs? Be really grateful if everyone's able to contribute to that poll, and we'll reflect on the answers just before we close up. Interesting. Just going to give a couple more seconds. Okay, so not everybody has answered yet, but overwhelmingly, most people are saying yes, nearly 70%. But we do have around 13% who have said, no, it doesn't meet their current needs. A few saying they're not sure, and a couple of them people saying that it's not applicable, and that may be that they haven't yet set up. Excellent. Okay. Just the last slides, please, Hannah. So I won't go into too much detail, but if you do need further support, you are able to contact us on our small charity help desk. That is knowhow@ncvo.org.uk by email or by calling the phone number on the screen. And on our new NCVO website, we have a dedicated web page to explain how we support small charities. And we've linked to that here and in the chat too. Before we share a quick feedback poll, which is really helpful for us to capture this information, to let us know what you thought of the webinar. I just want to say, because I'm aware we're running out of time, a huge thank you to Philip, Hannah and Chris for joining us today. Excellent presentation, covered so much information, and I really hope it was useful to our attendees today. I can see lots of clapping hands, so that's always a positive sign, I think. And we've just got some information here about how to get in touch with the Withers team for any follow-up. And all of this information will be included in the follow-up slide. And just on to our final slide. So as you know, NCVO is a membership body. We champion the voluntary sector and volunteer movement to create a better society. We've currently got over 17,000 voluntary sector member organisations, from the very smallest community groups, so not just registered charities, to very large charities. We've put some information there about how to find out about NCVO membership, but it's worth saying that NCVO membership is free for organisations with an income of under £30,000 and is on a tiered basis above that. If you could stop sharing the slides, Hannah. I feel like I rushed through that last little bit, but there's been a lot to cover, and we'll make sure to send all of that information through to you. I just want to say a final huge thank you again to Hannah, Phil and Chris for joining us today and giving up their time to go through this topic with us. As I said, any questions that haven't been answered, we'll make sure to get to those. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. You'll see the feedback poll